Hey everybody, I'm Robert.
Hi guys, I'm Chris.
And we're the Film Flamers. Love is in the air, and it's time for us to do another deep dive. So, what better film choice than Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula?
Exactly.
God knows I love a mouthful. So
it's the feel-good movie of February.
That's right. This movie has been on the docket for quite some time. I think since we decided we were going to start a podcast, I think we all knew, I think Chris and I both knew that eventually we were going to get to Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yes. And it proves to be a fairly contentious film, strangely enough.
Yeah, I don't hear a lot of people talking about it that often. And in fact, before rewatching it for this episode, I hadn't seen it since I was like 19 or 20. So we're talking like two decades ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, for me, I have to pick this movie off the shelf like once every 2 years or so, maybe, 2 to 3 years, because I just, I saw it at a very formative age. And, I wanted to see it as a kid for so long. And finally, for my birthday, my parents let me watch it and it freaked the fuck out of me. I think it was like my 11th birthday or something. I don't know. But yeah, I fell in love with it and I've watched it every few years since then. And I've shown it to people that had never seen it before. Matt hadn't seen it before and he dug a lot of it. But I have seen people, like another podcast came out and said they covered it. I forget who it was, but they didn't like it at all. And then I saw another post recently where they were doing like unpopular opinion threads or something, and it was like unpopular opinion, Dracula sucks or something like that.
Oh, that's bullshit.
And I was just like, what? So I don't know. I don't know. If you guys haven't seen it, check it out. Listen to this podcast. See us, listen to our deep dive, and let us know what you thought. Or if you hate the movie and don't want to watch it again, let us know why. What are the reasons? It would be very interesting to me.
I would also be interested to know those things. So, Bram Stoker's Dracula is a 1992 American Gothic romance horror film, another mouthful, directed and produced by Francis Ford Coppola. The screenplay was written by James V. Hart, based on the novel by Bram Stoker. Stars Gary Oldman as Count Dracula, Wynona Ryder as Mina Harker, Anthony Hopkins as Professor Van Helsing, and Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker.
And plenty of others that we're going to mention.
It's a stacked cast, for sure.
It really is. It's one of the best cast of any horror film.
Amen.
The score was composed by Wojciech Kilar and has a closing credits theme song written and performed by Annie Lennox called Love Song for a Vampire, which actually became an international success.
I just love it when you say that composer's name. I know, like, there have been multiple episodes where I'm just like in awe of it. And so
well, this is one of the best horror scores of all time. It just is. And you'll see it on a whole bunch of people's lists. It's definitely on mine. It's one of the first scores that I really fell in love with as a kid. And I've always had it on my favorite film score playlists. There's just so many good, motifs in it. And it's just so singular and iconic. It's been used in trailers and other films, and like so many things in this movie, it's, there's nothing quite like it.
Yeah. And for sure it made your list when we did our top 10 favorite movie scores countdown, back last, January of 2018. So,
yep. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
If you guys haven't listened to that episode, go back and check it out. It's a really good one. And so without further ado, let's just jump right in. This is Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Here occurred the frightening and shocking history of Prince Dracula and the woman he loved.
I have crossed oceans of time to find you.
Ja, Dracula.
There's a sinister, darker side to him I find irresistible. I have never met any man with such a passion for life. He is unlike any man. What are you?
Vampires do exist. This one we fight, this one we face. Can take on many forms. He is both young and old. He can appear as mist, as vapor, as the fog. And he can vanish at will.
My love.
The power of his evil desire has no end.
You've got to go to him. And you've got to love him.
She is a willing recruit and devoted disciple. She is the devil's concubine. Devil!
Join me in eternal life.
Your salvation is his destruction.
I want to be what you are. I want to see what you see. I want to love what you love. Take me away from all this death.
Make no mistake, he must be stopped.
In 1462, Vlad Dracula, played by Gary Oldman, leaves his home and wife, Elisabeta, played by Wynona Ryder, to battle the invading Turks. He returns home victorious, only to find that his wife has committed suicide by leaping from the castle to the river below after Dracula's enemies falsely reported his death. A priest at the castle tells him that her soul is eternally damned for taking her own life. Enraged, Dracula desecrates the chapel and renounces God, declaring that he will rise from the dead to avenge Elisabeta with all the powers of darkness. He stabs a stone cross and drinks the blood that pours out of it, only to realize moments later in agony what he had just done. 4 centuries later, in 1897 London, an ambitious solicitor named Jonathan Harker, played by Keanu Reeves, is assigned a new client, the Transylvanian Count Dracula. He is replacing a colleague, Renfield, played by Tom Waits, who has gone insane upon his return from visiting the Count. He breaks the news to his fiancée Mina, also played by Wynona Ryder, that he'll need to travel to Transylvania to finalize the Count's London real estate acquisitions. Mina is disheartened, but allows him to go while she stays in the home of her wealthy and very horny friend, Lucy Westenra, played by Sadie Frost. In Eastern Europe, Jonathan has a very strange trip to the Count, anchored by a warning from a gypsy who gives him a metal cross to wear, warning, "Den die Toten reiten schnell," for the dead travel fast. Jonathan arrives at the castle to meet a very old Count Dracula. While finalizing paperwork, Dracula discovers a photograph of Mina, who he recognizes as his long-dead wife Elisabeta. Dracula orders Jonathan to write letters to Mina, his family, and his firm, telling them that he will be staying at the castle for a month, which Jonathan begrudgingly agrees to. While settling in for the night, Dracula warns Jonathan about visiting other parts of the castle. He does so anyway, and explores some nearby rooms. In one such room, he is seduced by 3 women, who attack and feed on his blood. Dracula leaves Jonathan to the mercy of his brides, who continue to drain his blood each night, making him too weak to attempt escape. Dracula sets sail for London, sleeping in crates filled with decrepit soil from the bowels of his castle. None of the crew on the ship survived the journey. Meanwhile, back in London, Mina receives Jonathan's letter and is worried because he seems so cold and distant. She's distracted from her worries momentarily by a lavish party hosted by the Westenras, attended by Lucy's 3 suitors, Arthur Holmwood, played by Cary Elwes, Quincy Morris, played by Billy Campbell, and Dr. Jack Seward, played by Richard E. Grant, who's now treating the insane Renfield. Sometime after the party, Lucy agrees to marry Arthur, but Mina's still very worried about Jonathan. Dracula's ship arrives in London amid a fierce thunderstorm, and he emerges from his crate as a wolf-like creature in search of blood. He makes his way to the Westenra home, where he hypnotically seduces and feeds on Lucy. Mina interrupts the attack, and Dracula hides after recognizing her. As Mina leads her away, the traumatized Lucy exclaims that she can still taste her attacker's blood in her mouth. The next day, Mina walks the streets of London. She meets Dracula, who introduces himself as a visiting prince. After rudely rebuffing his advances, she apologetically accompanies him to a showing of the newly introduced cinematograph. But during the show, a wolf who had escaped the London Zoo in the storm of Dracula's arrival enters and frightens everyone away, except for Mina, whom it corners. Dracula comes to her rescue and tames the wolf, and in doing so charms Mina. They begin to see each other regularly, and Mina confides to her diary that she has developed feelings for him. Lucy, meanwhile, is preparing for her upcoming wedding to Arthur, but is taken strangely ill. She sends for her doctor and former suitor, Dr. Seward, who is perplexed by her symptoms. He sends for his respected teacher, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, played by Anthony Hopkins, who quickly travels to London to assist. Jonathan, still at Dracula's castle and at the mercy of his brides, has decided that he must escape once and for all in order to survive. After falling out of a window and into the river below the castle, he makes his way to a local convent, where the nuns write to Mina and request that she come immediately to his side. She writes to Dracula that she must leave and they must never see each other again, which both devastates and enrages him. Mina makes her way to Jonathan, and the two are married at the convent. Meanwhile, Dr. Van Helsing arrives in London, and his fears are quickly realized. Lucy is the victim of a vampire, and as she dies, she's becoming one herself. When Dracula attacks one last time, Lucy dies horrifically, and after her funeral is interred in the family crypt. That night, Van Helsing convinces and readies her suitors to make sure that she will not rise again. But when the four men enter the crypt, they find her coffin is empty. As Lucy enters the crypt feeding on a small child, the men attack her. She tries to escape to her coffin, but Van Helsing orders Arthur to pound a stake into her heart and then cut off her head. Mina and Jonathan return to London, where Van Helsing has discovered that the master vampire in question is none other than Count Dracula. The men decide to kill Dracula in his new home, Carfax Abbey, while Mina waits in the neighboring asylum in Dr. Seward's quarters. They exorcise all the decrepit earth with Christian rituals, depriving Dracula of any rejuvenating powers he has derived from it. During the attack, Dracula becomes a mist and enters Mina's room to reunite with her and confess the truth of his nature. In love, she allows him to feed off of her and drinks his blood in turn, condemning her to an eternal life of never-ending hunger. Van Helsing and the suitors return to Mina to discover the tryst, and after a brief display of his dark powers, Dracula escapes, and everyone gives chase after him, back to his castle in Transylvania. Mina is slowly dying whilst they travel, but she and Van Helsing finally make it to the castle before Dracula, where Van Helsing dispatches him of his vampire brides. Dracula approaches this castle with the hunters close behind. A battle with his gypsies ensues, and Quincy is stabbed in the back. As the sun disappears below the horizon, Dracula explodes from his last box of decrepit earth, only to get his throat slit by Jonathan, while the wounded Quincy stabs him in the heart with his large knife. Realizing Dracula is defeated, Mina comes to his defense, and the others allow them to retreat to the chapel, where centuries ago, Dracula held his dead wife. Dracula and Mina share a kiss in the chapel, and he begs Mina to give him peace. She thrusts the knife through his heart, lifting the curse as he lays dying. She decapitates him and gazes up at the ceiling fresco of Vlad and Elisabetta ascending to heaven, reunited at long last.
The end. There's a lot going on in this story. I know we say that all the time after a synopsis, but we try to be thorough, and this is classic literature, so there really was a lot going on.
Yeah, there's just like the novel, and I read the novel a couple times, and it's really just like a collection of letters, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is actually one of the only adaptions I feel like that really integrates those letters a lot. Yeah. In the writings and stuff, even like diary entries and everything. And I thought it did that well, and it actually serves as pretty good exposition, as compared to, some other ways of doing that.
And I'm sure that we'll talk about source material a little later on. I'll just preface it by saying like epistolatory novels like that are not something that I tend to gravitate towards. It's really not my bag. And so it took me a long time to finally make it all the way through Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel. Mm-hmm. Dracula was released on November 13th, 1992. It opened at number 1 at the box office with almost $31 million. It dropped off in subsequent weeks, losing over 50% of its audience after that first weekend, and ultimately would exit the top 5 after 3 weeks. However, it did go on to be a box office hit, grossing $83 million domestically. Worldwide, Dracula earned over $215 million against its budget of $40 million.
Yeah, and it had a lot of stuff around it too. Like it had like action figures, and it had like a
fucking video game.
Yeah, a video game that I really wanted. I never got. It was on my Christmas list for like 2 years straight. I never got it because
this
we
is
didn't
like
have
Super
a platform.
Nintendo time, right? I mean,
it was No, I think it was like a Sega Saturn or something weird, or it was something that I didn't have, and or maybe I don't know. There was different games, but anyway, it did well.
Yeah.
It was. I think it was a surprise. Dracula is certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes with 73% approval rating, with an audience score of 79%. The site's consensus reads, overblown in the best sense of the word, Francis Ford Coppola's vision of Bram Stoker's Dracula rescues the character from decades of campy interpretations and features some terrific performances to boot. I really completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Overblown in the best sense of the word is like a really good way to describe this movie, right?
I completely agree.
Yeah. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the movie an average rating of a B-.
This is fair. Roger Ebert gave the film 3 out of 4 stars, writing, I enjoyed the movie simply for how it looked and felt. Production designers Dante Ferretti and Thomas Sanders have outdone themselves. The cinematographer, Michael Bauhaus, gets into the spirit so completely, he always seems to light with shadows. Ebert did, however, voice criticisms over the film's narrative confusions and dead ends.
And that might be just as much to blame as, the original novel. I don't know. I like things that are kind of kept in mystery, and I think that this movie doesn't explain too much, certainly with a lot of the things they're showing going on in the background, but we'll get to all that later. Kenneth Turin of the LA Times called the film not particularly scary, not very sexy, and dramatically over the top, criticizing the tone and several of the casting decisions.
I can't agree with that at all. He's basically saying all the things that we like about the consensus and saying that it's bad. And I'm like, it's terrible. Terrible, terrible. Speaking of casting decisions, there's a lot of criticism of Keanu Reeves' performance as Jonathan Harker. Josh Winning of Total Film says that Reeves spoils the whole movie.
What?
He wrote, I know. I mean, it's not that bad.
No, it's not.
So Josh Winning wrote in a 2011 list called 50 Performances That Ruined Movies, you can visibly see Keanu trying not to end every one of his lines with, dude. The result, a performance that looks like the young actor is perpetually constipated, painful for all parties.
He's on a bunch of lists. This performance is on a bunch of lists. It's so horrible because there's a few choice scenes like him and Mina and then him and Dracula, that are just bad. And his accent has been on lists, of like the worst accents done by actors, so fair enough, but I don't think it's so bad that it ruins the movie.
No.
And it's just kind of takes me out of it for like 2 scenes where he's just terrible, and from there on out he's kind of used a little bit less, but in the scenes that he is in, he works really well with the ensemble, because I was really trying to pay attention to that. And like I said, I feel like he gets better, or at least as a character he gets better as the movie goes along, where he gets a little bit more agency.
And he really doesn't have all that much screen time anyway, I mean, it's a really small part in the whole of this particular movie. I mean, hell, even some of the suitors have larger parts than he does. So
yeah, that's true. Dr. Sword. But he just has this like linchpin role, right? Where it's just kind of the cornerstone of this movie, where he is the audience, he is how we meet Dracula, really, for the story. And he's a freaking, wooden bench for the audience to sit on.
Dude, come on.
Dude. A feature by Ask Men called Acting Miscast That Ruin Movies expressed something similar. It's one thing to cast Keanu Reeves as the esteemed British lawyer, but it's quite another to ask him to act alongside Gary Oldman and Anthony Hopkins.
I don't know about esteemed British lawyer, but I mean, if you're acting alongside Anthony Hopkins, especially in this movie, I think that, everyone's going to be overshadowed a little bit by him. So here's what Coppola had to say about his casting choice, though. He said, we tried to get some kind of matinee idol for the part of Jonathan because it's not such a great part. If we were all to go to the airport together, Keanu is the one the girls would just besiege. So
fair enough for the time, I guess. And since then, Keanu has found roles where he doesn't have to be emotional at all and can just kind of write out a movie. And you know what? He's found his niche and it's great.
And by God, he's stood the test of time. He does not look very much different at all. He's aged incredibly well.
Yeah, he was the real vampire.
Good for you, Keanu.
Because fucking Gary Oldman looks like an old man now. Although Wynona Ryder looks amazing now too, though. So it's
she really does. Maybe it's just those 90s actors just haven't aged at all. I don't know. They signed some sort of deal with the devil.
So this movie was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, winning 3 of them for costume design, best sound editing, and best makeup, all extremely well deserved, in my opinion, with 1 loss for best art direction, which lost to Howard's End.
It was nominated for 4 BAFTAs, visual effects, costume design, makeup, and production design, but won none of them.
It got 5 Saturn Awards, one for Best Horror Film, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Writing, Best Costumes, and 5 losses. So it was nominated for 10 Saturns. It lost for Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor, Best Music, Best Makeup, and Best Special Effects. How the fuck did this lose Best Music at the Saturn Awards, which is even I need to know what won. I was shocked that it wasn't nominated for music for Academy Award.
Well, that was a really good year for music. As far as the Academy Awards go, I know that. I mean, so Aladdin won that year, and I don't think there's any stopping Aladdin, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other nominees that year for Best Score were Basic Instinct was one of them. And so, I mean, after having listened to this score quite a bit since watching the movie the other day, I mean, I completely agree with you. It should have got an Oscar nomination. And quite frankly, it didn't stand a chance for Best Original Song either. Because, I mean, I sort of remembered it being nominated for Academy Award for Best Original Song, but no, So I think with Aladdin and The Bodyguard that year, no movie stood a chance in that particular fucking category. So sorry, Annie Lennox.
Fuck, A Whole New World won over fucking I Have Nothing from Bodyguard.
Yeah. So, I mean...
Whatever. Which one's lasted? Well, I guess both.
Which one hasn't lasted,
nothing.
probably?
Which one do I keep singing every day?
Not a love song for a vampire. The film has appeared on many, many lists after its release, such as Entertainment Weekly's 5 Best Vampire Movies, Esquire's 20 Best Vampire Movies, and Sexiest Horror Movies Ever Made. And fucking to that. This movie is sexy as hell.
Gary Oldman's performance has also been on many lists, including The Guardian's 10 Best Screen Vampires, the best version of Dracula, according to Screen Rant, and Sci-Fi's 25 greatest movie performances from the last 25 years.
Rightfully so, I'd say.
Should we talk about a little bit of the background first for this movie and how it was made?
Yeah, because there's a whole lot to unpack as far as production goes, and I think the best way to start talking about this is I guess from the movie's inception, right? So
the movie was made in part because of Wynona Ryder, right? So she's a huge fan of the book, and then got her hands on the script that had been kind of floating around, and immediately brought it to Francis Ford Coppola. So the meeting was going to happen anyway because she had to drop out of The Godfather Part 3 at short notice due to being super exhausted and medically exhausted or whatever that's called, which put the movie weeks behind schedule. So she was trying to clear the air between them, and she basically, upon parting, and it was fine, they had got along, they kind of made their peace, she left the script. She's like, read this if you can. And she's like, this is Francis Ford Coppola, he's never going to be interested in a genre film. But Francis Ford Coppola was always a fan of the book. In fact, he was a camp counselor, and he read the entire book over the course of the camp to kids to help them fall asleep.
What?
Yeah, to 9-year-old boys. Yeah, so she saw his eyes light up when he saw the title. And so that was just Marriage Made in Heaven. And so they both went to Columbia and tried to, start making the movie. And, obviously it got made. But the love story component is actually not Francis Ford Coppola. It's actually, of course, all due to the screenplay by James Hart. And James Hart has also done a bunch of other adaptations like Frankenstein, and a bunch of other literary adaptations too.
So he did the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that followed this one, right? Yeah. So it started this whole renaissance of, horror literature that was being made after this.
Yeah.
The love story part is not in the novel, right? I mean, Mina and Jonathan's really, but
Yeah, and it might be alluded to if you read it that way, but I think this was kind of new, just a way to kind of sell the film or just a new take on it while still being, even more like I was watching a YouTube video of like how close to the original source material. And this is like first or second place of all like the 30 fucking Dracula films that have been made. This is like the first or second place as far as close to the material. Right. And still with that kind of emphasized or added romance story. But this guy also did like Hook and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as we just said, Muppet Treasure Island,
Yay.
Contact,
You don't
like Contact?
No, what a fucking slog that movie is.
Oh my God, I love that movie. Yeah, based on the novel by Carl Sagan. So he does a lot of these book adaptions, So that the romantic story is basically due to him. And so like Francis Ford Coppola doesn't take any credit for it, though he said it was interesting. But he tried to do his best to make it authentic to the book as he could outside of the screenplay, as well as like interject some points of history that we now know about, like Vlad the Impaler with visual storytelling, like the beginning, as well as like the book Van Helsing is looking at, Vampire. Yeah. I think it's the same book in Buffy.
Yeah, it really does look very similar, doesn't it?
Might have been a call out.
I have to say, I really enjoyed the romantic aspect being added to this. When I was in the 8th grade taking honors English, we had a list of classic novels, and one a month we had to choose and read. And if you completed the entire list, meaning you read extra, you got some special award at the end of the year. And I'm so nerdy that I was going to do that, right? And so I was like, well, I'll just read Dracula. It's horror. I'll like it. And like I said earlier, like epistolatory novels, I just don't like, maybe with the exception of A Color Purple. But I could not make it through this. And I was like, that's okay. I've seen the movie, And so I went to take the test and failed miserably. So while it's close to the source material, if you solely rely on the movie, then you're not going to do well in your English courses. So let that be a lesson to everyone listening. Read the book.
Yeah, I read the book several times and I actually didn't have a problem with that. Maybe at first I did. And I was just like it was just like adjustment in my mind, like this is almost like a found footage equivalent of a book, right? Where it's just like, hey, here's all these collections of letters and stuff like that. And I think that in part is why it succeeded so much in 1896 or 1900 or whatever, when this book was published, because it was almost like I said, found footage where it's like, oh my God, did this actually happen or something like that? Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting to see it from that point of view. And most people don't know that about the book.
I think that I would like to go back and maybe listen to it. If you could find like an audio copy or something where it was treated more like a radio drama or something where someone was reading the letters,
actually,
the diary entries.
Yeah.
Then...
So this is a fun fact that actually hit my cutting room floor. But Richard E. Grant, who played Dr. Seward, actually is the one that reads the audiobook, if you're interested.
Oh. Okay, I am. So there we go. Thank you for that.
There you go. So Francis Ford Coppola really wanted to portray Dracula as a fallen angel, like vis-a-vis Satan or Lucifer. His fall is almost like a direct opposite or a twisted version of Christ's ascension, or at least communion, with like the drinking of the blood and stuff. And you could talk about this like in the history of vampires themselves. But it's implied and stated several times that this was a man of great renown and courage and intelligence in life. But it was an even greater is the need to stamp him out utterly from existence, just kind of like the Lucifer myth, right? And Francis Ford Coppola knew that the studio would not allow him to go on location and like in Romania and shoot all the actual castle, shoot in the actual Castle Dracula, which is not really the Castle Dracula, but they say it is for tourism, especially after his legendarily like over budget over time on movies like Apocalypse Now, even though that was kind of his own money in that case. But he told them that he would do it completely 100% in local studios, and they jumped all over that. And so he had originally wanted to shoot on location, but he knew that they wouldn't. So he got excited about creating an illusion, just as they were at the turn of the century when they were, telling stories and like the rise of the cinematograph that they actually show in the movie, and how like magic shows and illusions were done. And he wanted to make the movie like that. So that was part of how he got so excited about it. So he wanted to shoot it with those limitations and how it would have been shot with illusions and forced perspective and et cetera, and use no modern techniques or visual special effects. I think the only thing that I caught while watching it was like contact lenses for the vampires.
And it's super impressive. I mean, everything that he and his son, right, were able to create in this movie is just astounding to me. And it's just so visually pleasing. And I mean, it goes to show you that you don't have to rely so heavily on computers. You can create things like this and make it look wonderful.
Well, and it is not that it looks wonderful. In some cases, it looks a little awkward, but that makes it look real and grounded because it all is happening in camera, or with like, at the very least with running the same film, you know, twice and exposing it several times with different film reels or whatever, the same way they would have had to do it back then, matting out parts of the screen, you know, so like the 10 Commandments were made, or, you know, things like that. But there's something with the tone of this film that's so singular, because like looking at how it was made, they made like mood boards with all these like classic paintings of hell and demons and, different things for the costumes and how it would look and feel. And they're like, here's a mood board for Act 1, here's a mood board for Act 2. And so they really tried to nail down a tone for the film before they ever started shooting anything. Right. And I feel like there's something almost like a graphic novel about this film, with like a series of moments that this whole film is like centered around, and panels. It gives the film almost like a sense, like right on the edge of tongue in cheekness, even though it takes itself seriously, but then it looks at you with like a wink and a grin.
I think I read somewhere that they storyboarded everything and then sort of set the storyboards to film. So there's almost like a animated version of Francis Ford Coppola's movie. Like they literally shot the storyboards as they were drawn or something like that. You know, so I mean, that's something that I would like to see very much. I would like to see how close some of these storyboards were to what they actually got on film.
And actually quite close in some cases. Like some costumes were like, one of the costumes was from a Klimt painting called The Kiss, right? And it's like Dracula's golden burial costume or whatever. And it's straight up from a painting.
I do like the sense of melodrama in this movie, though, because I know when you say like wink and a grin, and we will certainly talk about some of like the almost overacting in this movie. I really, like I said before on this podcast, I really enjoy melodrama. It's something that I grasp onto. But in the case of this particular movie, this is the kind of things that people would be watching during that time period. Anything shown on stage or any sort of like early film would be incredibly over the top as far as like acting goes, or gestures and things like that. And this movie just kind of feels all around like some sort of homage to not only like early cinema, but to literature itself.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I completely love that.
So what did you think about this cast overall?
I love the cast of this movie, and I really didn't know what to expect going in on this rewatch, because it had been so long since I've seen it, and I literally remembered next to nothing, you know, and then I started watching it and things are like flooding back to me about how much I liked it the few times that I saw it as a teenager. But the cast in this movie is great, and there were some members of the cast on this particular rewatch that I noticed almost for the first time, like Tom Waits, for sure.
Oh, Tom Waits is amazing. He's a revelation in this movie.
For real. And I don't know if maybe I just didn't pay that close attention to him on earlier watches because you're so wrapped up in the story or the bigger characters. And as I've grown older, I've really grown to love supporting characters in movies and TV shows, and he's just so good in this movie. He's so fully committed to that particular part.
No small parts, man. Like, he's a perfect example of that in this movie.
I mean, it was just amazing. I thought he was great. And I mean, and I really liked Sadie Frost a lot too in this. I thought that she was fantastic, and that really could be the character and not the actress so much, but I don't know. I thought that she was just fantastic.
Well, she has a face for it, but I do wonder how different this film would be if Jonathan Harker had been better cast. Like, originally Johnny Depp was cast as Jonathan Harker due to his friendship with Wynona Ryder, but the studio refused to cast him because he wasn't big enough at the time. But both Wynona and Johnny Depp pleaded with Francis Ford Coppola, who they thought had power, over that. But of course, he can't go against the studio. So they ended up with another friend of Wynona Ryder's, Keanu Reeves, who was bigger at the time. And I'm wondering if Johnny Depp really would have done a better job.
I don't know. Like, I like Johnny Depp for the most part in some movies, but not always, and I would say more often than not, I don't care for him. The thing is that to me, the part of Jonathan Harker in this movie is not very big, like I said before. And so I really don't think it matters who you put in that particular role. And also, I don't think that Keanu Reeves really destroyed this movie.
No,
I don't think it's fair to put him on those lists or whatever. He's not great in it, but he's not terrible.
every time I watch it, he kind of pulls me out of the movie and I'm just like, what the fuck are you doing, man? You know, this could have ended his career, but thankfully it didn't. But it's a shame that a few bad performances really kind of put a stain on this movie. Like Keanu, Wynona, and Sadie Frost all have moments of wooden and flat delivery, especially at the beginning of the movie. But fortunately, the movie also has some great performances, like including one for the history books with Gary Oldman. And then you've got Anthony Hopkins, and of course the revelation that is Tom Waits. And then Richard E. Grant did an excellent job. Carrie Elwes is always serviceable and fun to see. Billy Campbell, as Quincy, was good. Although I do wonder if his co-star from The Rocketeer, Jennifer Connelly, would have been a better Mina.
It's so hard for me to try to go back and recast this movie. Like, I also love Jennifer Connelly, and I think that she probably would have done a good job. But I don't know. Like, having watched it now on this rewatch, I can't really imagine anybody else playing these roles. Like, I realize that Wynona Ryder had some moments of woodenness and whatnot, but ultimately I think that she did a really good job in this movie too. I mean, ultimately she was nominated for a Saturn Award, and so, I mean, there's that. But yeah, I think ultimately this movie performed well with the people that were in it. And I'm not sure if you were to cast somebody aside from Wynona Ryder that the movie would have made as much money. She was a big star at the time.
Well, she also did really, really well as the movie went on. All of them did. Even Keanu Reeves was better as the movie went on, as I've said before. Sadie Frost is excellent as the vampire when she becomes that, and all those moments of drama that she had to do, transforming and dying and everything else, and Keanu Reeves gets a little bit better, but he has less and less to do, but I would say, even Wynona, as she's going through her issues becoming a vampire and stuff, she does really, really well. It's a lot of, opportunity for an actor to do something, versus read their fucking diary. But, I feel like some of it's the material, some of it's just like the acting. I know that this movie actually had a first and second unit, like most do, but the first and second unit both had 68 days of shooting, like concurrently, right? So you had Roman Coppola doing 68 days of directing, and you had Francis doing 68 days. And so they both had a lot of time with the principal actors. So, you wonder, which director would have, did which scene and which director would have maybe done a little bit better. I don't know. I
think that ultimately, if we're talking about the cast in this movie too, we have to give serious props to Gary Oldman and Anthony Hopkins. I think that both of them sort of steal the show, and rightfully so. I mean, the movie's called Dracula. So ultimately you have to make that character likable and scary, and I think that Gary Oldman does all those things. But my favorite person in this movie, my favorite character to watch in this movie is Van Helsing for sure. I mean,
I've watched this and through periods of my life, and I feel like Dracula was my favorite, and then Van Helsing was my favorite, and this watch in particular, I don't know, maybe I'm feeling just a little extra gay coming off of My Girls Just Want a Weekend in Mexico with my sister, but I was like, Lucy's my favorite character. Like, everyone needs a friend like Lucy.
I really enjoyed the fact that there's two women in this movie, for the most part, and they're both incredibly horny. Is it like we're used to seeing all these comedies where guys are the horny ones and whatnot, but in this movie, no, it's the two women, and they are horny from the minute where Jonathan is talking to Mina and saying he has to go away, and she's like, but come over here to the side and let's canoodle over here in the garden. And then looking at that book with those drawings in it, Kama Sutra drawings. And yeah. I was like, get those two women together and they are just they want to get laid so bad. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. When Lucy says, I want the D, maybe she should have been a little bit more explicit. Doesn't he sign his letters like that? D. D.
Oh my God. I was just so pleasantly surprised to see such horny women in a movie. I don't know.
It's a force of nature.
But no, you're right. Lucy is a great character. I think that she's fun. She's engaging. And I mean, it's somebody, I don't know. I think that as a vampire, she was just fantastic. I love that scene in the crypt very, very much.
Oh, yeah. Well, before we get too much into specific moments, there's something I really want to kind of get into a little bit, which is the special effects, because there's nothing really like it, in modern cinema. And even then, everything was done in camera. Like the team that Francis Ford Coppola brought on to do special effects eventually just told him that it was impossible to do things that way anymore. Like it would be more money, more time. But eventually Coppola fired them because he wasn't getting what he was asking for. And he actually ended up hiring his 20-something-year-old son instead to do, due to his obsession with in-camera effects and magic, and illusion. So for example, instead of creating that, there's a scene where, the train passes over the diary in kind of a montage and
Right.
you can see the shadow of the smoke and the train going over the diary, right? You do that with compositing today, super easy, maybe the shadow's a little bit less so, but you'd be able to do it really easily digitally in comparison. So what they ended up having to do was literally create a 15-foot wide diary and have the model train in back of it so they could all shoot it in one plate, And so it's just stuff like that makes it all so real in the camera. All of the castles and houses, buildings, Carfax Abbey, all of that stuff was just models, set behind, and then with double exposure and everything else.
I was watching the movie too, and I maybe it's just random in my brain or some weird call out, but every time they had a wide shot and you could see the entirety of the castle, it looked to me like The Wicker Man, right? Or
so that's from a painting. So it's showing the road to hell, and the devil I think is on a throne or whatever, and his head kind of goes up above the clouds or whatever. And so they wanted to look like a decrepit, scary, disgusting, demonic, dilapidated castle, but a man on its throne, just
and it did
dead
look like
on his
that.
throne. And so it really did, and it looks pretty iconic. And of course they show what it looked like back then, in kind of the beginning of the film, and it looks beautiful. So they were able to do kind of both sides to it, which is really good. The art, the production design was amazing. I love the shadows. I love what they do with the shadows in this film. And I love that they can affect physical objects and act on their own. I love that they were all done in camera with no animation. So the famous first one where Dracula's shadow is going up to Jonathan and strangling him or whatever. Mm-hmm. That was all rear projection, right? So the entire wall behind them, including the giant map that's behind them and everything, was just rear projection. That's the only way they could do it, And so everything was just in camera, and it just makes everything look so much more real. It was just a guy miming Gary Oldman behind the screen, It's just how they could have done it in 1900, and it just gives this movie kind of a charm, right? But there's a lot of good subtle effects that were done in camera this film. When Dracula's giving Harker a shave, the tapestry covered walls are actually literally closing in on him. And I'm not sure how many watches I noticed that before. I caught it this time. It gave me the chills. I had to rewind it because you can literally see the walls just literally being pushed in. And as soon as Dracula sees the cross, I guess, that he's wearing, the crucifix in the reflection of the razor, the walls just jump back. And it's a big room again. And I was just holy shit, there's a lot of this subtle stuff going on in the background. This time I also caught projections of the diary as Jonathan's writing Mina from the castle kind of on the wall in the background, really, really light getting written and stuff. So it was just a lot of subtle, interesting work like that. The rats climbing on the ceiling, I think, is one thing that you notice.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me, everything about that castle, it's the laws of physics and nature just don't apply to it, right? And they show that with a lot of camera effects or practical visual effects. And you have mice running upside down and the shadows and the light, as you were already talking about, the way the sound carries in there, right? It just sounds neat and it looks neat. Everything they did in that castle setting at the very beginning of the movie just really creates a good tone and feel for what's going on. It's moody as fuck, and I love it.
Yeah.
So,
and I feel the production design overall, not just including things in the periphery, all the visual effects and things like that, but things as obvious as the costumes, right? And so this movie kind of coined, at least in the industry, the term, the costumes are the sets. Right. And so you've got a lot of other movies that kind of try and kind of copy that a little bit. And it's almost like Kubrick or even Citizen Kane in nature, where you've got all these you've got these actors, but they're kind of the jewels of the set, and the sets are these giant cavernous things that the actors are in the center of, are kind of moving around in to kind of almost create a sense of claustrophobia. But I do want to say that the sets are wonderful. So I don't think that's quite fair, right? Like the costumes are genius works of art, but the sets are gorgeous, especially in like the manor house and Dracula's castle.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the sets look amazing and they're very intricate in lots of places. And I think that's really hard to do sometimes in movies, especially when you have something as striking as some of the costumes to pull away from what's going on in the background, right? And the sets are great, but these costumes are iconic and striking and completely memorable. Even the smaller ones, like Mina's green dress and top hat that she's wearing around London,
totally.
right? I think is amazing. I would fucking own that and wear it every damn day, you know? And even like small touches to the costumes, like his round John Lennon-esque sunglasses, right? I mean, you cannot get that visual out of your head. Mm-hmm. And even like larger things, like his suit of armor that looks like muscle, right? Like actual sinuous muscle is amazing looking. But my favorite piece of costume in this movie is Lucy's wedding dress. Yep. Like, because it looks ridiculous when she's first getting tailored in it. And it's not until she's dead, you know, that I'm like, what a striking piece of costume. It's just
she looks monolithic.
Amazing.
She looks iconic with her white skin and red lips and drop of blood. And then everything on her is white lace, you know, and it's just like a weird juxtaposition that makes it so creepy. But like, that's what he wanted. He wanted these costumes to be the jewels of the sets, right? He wanted the eye to go to them and everything kind of else to fall into the background. The production designer did not agree with this theory and was eventually fired as well. However, Francis Ford Coppola noticed that elaborate sets were being made for fairly cheap at a nearby studio. So he got 2 young production designers from the set of Hook.
Oh,
of course, which is also a screenplay that the same, screenwriter, wrote. But, the costume designer, Aiko Ishioka, if I said that right, she rightly stated that, Dracula has a very cliched style over its varied film history. Like it's pretty much one note, and she wanted to stray as far away from that as possible. So everything from the armor to the dresses and suits in London to the insane asylum guard was designed meticulously to have a certain look and feel. So like many of the costumes are based off of insects or lizards. Some of the best examples of this were, of course, Dracula's armor at the beginning, and of course, Lucy's wedding and burial dress. Dracula's burial garb is also, of course, like I said earlier, based off of that Klimt painting called The Kiss. And I want that goddamn orange nightgown.
The one that she's running through the garden.
Yeah, it's a little flowy.
It's so flowy. You know what? I swear to God, you should get one in orange. I'll get one in green, and let's just see if we can just like recreate that scene in my backyard or something sometime.
No, we need to go to the fucking Overlook Hotel or whatever, the one that actually has the labyrinth.
That's right.
And like wait for a stormy day and go out there and run around in those nightgowns from Bram Stoker.
I'm sure that nobody will look at us funny, but hey, I don't fucking care.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up the Insane Asylum too, because I completely forgot about the costumes in that setting.
Yeah.
His straitjacket with the really long arms, the like striped looking one, is just
it's ribbed.
Amazing too.
And like they have like cages over their hands and cages over the heads and stuff like that. And so it's just a completely designed movie. Nothing was just half-assed.
Nope.
So a lot of the money went into the costumes. I love how iconic Dracula is, the look of Dracula, right? We haven't talked about that yet. This is a very singular, famous, iconic look for Dracula, nearly as famous now, I'd say, just as the classic look of Dracula with this stupid little black tux or whatever he's wearing, Well,
and depending on the generation of the person that you're talking to, I would say that it may have surpassed that at this point. I mean, like Bela Lugosi will always be an iconic Dracula, but, when I think of Dracula, I don't necessarily go straight to like a tuxedo and a widow's peak. I go straight to old Dracula and that long red robe. Yeah?
Baboon ass for hair.
I mean, that's the first thing that I think of when I think of Dracula now. I mean, it's so iconic that, even The Simpsons did it for a Treehouse of Horror, and so it's
Bart Simpson's
something that's
Dracula.
seared into... Yep. It's just seared into people's brains. And what a well-deserved Oscar win. If there ever was in the history of the Academy, like the costumes for this movie deserved every award that it got.
Yeah.
Certainly that Oscar.
Mm-hmm. So there are so many good moments. I know I said earlier that this movie almost feels like a collection, just like a huge amount of like moments that the whole movie is kind of built around. But there's so many like film classic moments. I feel like Elizabeth Bates' suicide at the beginning, just how they did that with like the clouds and, becoming Dracula, that whole sequence, the shadows entering Dracula's castle for the first time, the licking of the razor is a huge moment.
Yes.
The brides, Dracula on the wall crawling, down it, Dracula laughing with the baby. It's the voice the laugh that they use on all the trailers. Dracula at the window, before he breaks through and kills Lucy. Almost every scene with Van Helsing and Dracula actually is just iconic. Maybe I'm fanboying a little bit too much, but I just feel like these are really, really well put together moments,
No, I completely agree. I think that razor looking scene for sure, because I put that down in my notes while I was watching it. I said it was almost Hannibal-esque. Like, it reminded me so much of that. I was like, we had just come off of, Silence of the Lambs in 91, right? And then now we have this, like, another licking scene, or like, I mean, I don't know.
And Gary Oldman was drunk during that scene.
Are you serious?
It was midnight. They were like way over time, and like they wanted to do a night shoot because like it would get people in the mood. That's what, Francis Ford Coppola does. He does all these little weird things like that. And so he was drunk, and he was probably drinking because Keanu's accent was so horrible. I mean, and everyone that's supposed to be British, except for like maybe Carrie Elwes, is like having to, is doing a different accent. Like Van Helsing, Anthony Hopkins is having to do some other weird accent, and Gary Oldman is having to do a Transylvanian accent. But all these Americans are doing British accents, so it must have been really annoying for all the British actors. So
he was drunk, and he was really trying to cut his throat, but instead he just licked it or something. He's like, I'm just going to stop this right now. The crypt scene is, of course, I think for me, the most iconic scene in this movie, when she's walking down the steps holding that baby and she's in that white dress. And I just like, it's scary. It scares me when she does that.
So it's everything came together. The costume, the set itself is amazing, like haunting, beautiful. But like the sound design, all the little kind of laughs and stuff in the background, and cackling, and it's just like the sound design of this film overall is amazing, especially in like Dracula's castle, where you hear just like hints of things in the background, but this scene in particular, just they had to shoot things backwards to get her back into her coffin, and it just looks so unnatural. Jesus Christ, it looked just really off-putting, and like even the cloth that she's moving in is moving the wrong way it should, so it looks kind of off, and it's just because they ran it backwards, and it's just done so well.
And even when you have scenes like that where like you think it would be tense and scary, a lot of it gets cut with some over-the-top, well, I want to say humor, and that may not be what they intended, you know what I mean? But when she like vomits blood all over somebody, it sort of takes you out of that intensity for a little bit and puts you right back in the movie. And then, Anthony Hopkins will turn around and then make some sort of one-liner, So I mean, like
I said,
this movie really
it takes itself seriously, and then it like gives you a little slight smile and a wink, And
I think that's why I like it so much. You're totally like grounded in the movie, and then all of a sudden he's like ha 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 and says something, and I'm like, okay, this is really good.
You grab your ankles for the horror, and then it gives you a reach around.
What a wonderful metaphor.
I really like the giant vampire bat scene where he's, basically making vampire love to Mina, and they all come in and catch, and he turns into this massive like vampire bat, and he like stomps his foot in the, Van Helsing's cross turns on fire or whatever. The whole scene is really, really horrific to me, and I just loved how he backs into the shadows, and it's just rats, and it's just such an iconic scene to me.
And I mean, and I also wanted to bring up the garden scene, like the Lucy seduction scene, where he first gets off the boat and he's sort of like the wolf creature, and it's very ethereal looking, very dreamlike, and she's sighing and running, and she's got that whole orange nightgown working for her. And then when Mina gets out there and sees it, like the horror immediately strikes you in the face, because she's essentially being raped, and it's I don't know, it's a lot to take in, but it's very, very pretty at the same time. It's just a well shot moment of a movie.
Well, they had to strike that balance a lot with like the romantic, the gothic romance, and like the absolute like sheer horror. Like I want to say that whole, you know, Dracula seducing Mina part, like in London or whatever. Like at first, like I don't really like get it, and then like you get sold because he's just so convincing. Like,
it's charming.
I've crossed oceans of time to find you, you know.
Oh my god, that could quite possibly be the sexiest thing that one person can say to another. I don't know. Like, if someone said that to me, I'd be like, okay.
Like you're rude to a guy, and then, you know, he's like, I'm a prince and I'm your servant, and I've crossed oceans of time to be with you. It's like,
she's like, I guess we can go to the movies.
No, the next thing she said was, I want the D.
Yeah. Just spending too much time with Lucy.
Yeah. So like, yeah. And then that ending scene, you know, with the motif at the top, you know, it was supposed to end after she just stabs him through the heart. You know, to me, you know, getting it out and decapitating him always kind of seemed like, it's a little bit much. Like, just like, okay, we're taking it. But actually, he screened the film for George Lucas. Huh. And George Lucas said, no, she should take the thing out and decapitate him. So they did a reshoot and she decapitates him.
Hey, I mean, it's just like an over-the-top moment in a movie filled with over-the-top moments. And like, I like the ending quite a bit, especially when it, you know, leads up to that fresco. And it's a really touching ending to a movie, you know, despite its bloody, violent end.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I'm okay with that, you know. I mean, I was crying at the end of this rewatch watching that particular moment. So, I mean, it works.
Did you see any like call outs to any other films, do you think?
I mean, like there were a couple, I think, and I don't know how far I'm reaching with some of this, but I think there's a lot of like call outs to The Exorcist. I don't know. I mean, maybe with some of the like religious iconography and how everything takes place in a bedroom kind of thing. But mostly when they are guarding Lucy before she dies and he's like coming up to the final attack scene and everything is done with a camera, right? So it's a camera shooting up to Billy Campbell and then a camera shooting into the room and very fast moving. It just reminded me very much of The Evil Dead. And I was just wondering, you know, how much of that they wanted to do for the sake of this particular movie, or did they want to like call out some other horror movies that were made, right?
I actually loved how that was photographed because Evil Dead is a smooth camera versus this was done almost like stop motion a little bit. And so it's like you see a guy, he's on the ground, and then you see his hand, and then you see blood splatter the hand, and then you're going forward. And it just really creates like this animalistic speed to it. It's not that stupid, like drunken style that we saw from Fallen, you know, that we both kind of hated, you know, but this was done in such a way that it's really visceral, and I really liked how it was done, and it didn't just like look so contrived.
But no, it was just the very first thing that popped into my head during that scene, and I was just like, oh, this is like Evil Dead, you know? I mean, we have a character's point of view of the camera, and it's sort of racing up to its end game, and I mean, that's the first thing that I think of when I see something like that.
I think the romance part, it might have been a little bit taken from the 1974's version of Dracula, where he goes to England to get the lost love or whatever. So this was not the first romantic take on Dracula by any means. I think that there's some nods to, yet again, other Dracula films like I Don't Drink Wine, you know, that's not from the fucking book, you know, and I feel like there's a real reference to Kubrick a lot just on how it was shot with the large sets and everything else and the framing, but also with the bed when Lucy finally dies and the blood just like comes in waves from the sides. It's reminding me of that part in The Shining where the blood's coming out from the elevator, right? And
exactly,
it's like metaphorical or whatever. It's not real, but it's so over the top. You're like, holy shit, you know, it's such a jarring scene. I've shown this movie to several people over the years, and that's always a scene people are like, what? when the wolf kills her, and then all of a sudden you just see like waves of blood coming from the sides hitting the bed, and it's just like, and then they walk in and then nothing's bloody, you know?
Well, it's kind of like that scene in The Hours where Julianne Moore lays in the bed and the water like rushes over it too, you know? Yeah. I mean, and that was made well after this. So, I mean, here we have Francis Ford Coppola probably influencing other directors later on.
And you actually mentioned The Exorcist, and I'm wondering now, because that whole thing with Lucy in the bed and basically the need to exorcise her is something in the books, or in the book, I should say. So I'm wondering if Exorcist was actually kind of inspired by the original Bram Stoker novel in a way from those bed scenes with Lucy.
I mean, it's quite possible. I know that novel itself is sort of based on a real life case, quote unquote. But I mean, the author obviously took liberties, and there was so much bedside stuff as far as Lucy goes, and she was battling what they would consider to be a demon, and so it's very, very Exorcist all through it.
And then I'm sure this was also kind of, at least even if it's just subconsciously, inspired by the film The Exorcist, as well. But those moments in the film that we're talking about also breed a lot of like quotes, some of my favorites being like, we did a top 10 and several came from, Bram Stoker's for favorite, horror movie quotes. Some of my favorites are like Den die Toten reiten schnell for The Dead Travel Fast. I always loved that. In the new Netflix adaptation, they didn't put that in, even though they showed the gypsies. And I'm just like, what? Why didn't you do that? It's like one of the best lines. It's from an ancient like poem. Even Charles Dickens kind of alluded to it in The Christmas Carol. He's like, oh, so you travel fast. And he's like, yes, I ride on the wind, or something like that when he's talking to the ghost of Marley. So, I always liked that in the novel as well as this movie. Of course, we've already talked about I've crossed oceans of time to find you.
And it's delivered just so well by Gary Oldman in this. I can't even do it.
And Anthony Hopkins can make anything sound iconic, but you do not let your eyes see nor your ears hear what you cannot account for. He just, like in any other actor, that might have just sounded like a normal line, but he just made it sound so official. I don't know. And of course, there's those iconic Dracula things like, you impotent men with their foolish spells cannot protect you from my power, Do you think you can destroy me with your false or with your idols? I who served the cross, I who commanded nations hundreds of years before you were born. Those are just juicy, juicy lines where Gary Oldman can just spit them out while he's eating all of the scenery.
Well, and I think that everybody remembers the line that I think was also in the original Dracula, right? Where he's like, the children of the night, what sweet music they make.
That's
right?
from the novel as well.
What sweet music they make. I can't. His accent was so good.
What sweet music they make. He said it differently, all those iconic lines. And then Wynona gets to sell one really well. That actually kind of makes me grab my grasp my pearls a little bit. Take me away from all this death.
Yeah, that was like iconic from the trailer, right? Because I remember that when I was a kid, because I wanted to see this movie so badly in the theater, and my mother took me to see it, and I think that she was a little, antsy watching it, because a little bit more sexual than what she had thought it was going to be. And I mean, like, as far as my parents, like violence and horror, they didn't really care, but when it came to like some sexual situations, they were a little, iffy about. So
I have my opinions on that.
I don't know. I mean, and I do too, kind of, but I don't think she was expecting it to be all that sexy. But I remember that line from the trailer, because she like looks up and says it in just such a way, and she carries out the last syllable of death so well. It's just a really well delivered line.
Well, she has to convince him to get, basically, because he loves her too much, to condemn her, which is a kind of a beautiful but somehow strangely awkward scene because of how just ugly he is in the scene. But she's just like, she's trying to convince him to do it anyway, and so she just has like one moment to do it, and she sells it. She does it, and I really like that, that scene where he's just like, he looks at her and he knows, like, fuck, I'm not gonna, she wants this as much as I want it, so I'm just gonna do it,
And speaking of sexy scenes, and I know we've already talked about moments, but it just occurred to me that when I saw this movie as a young, gay tween, right? I think it was like 13 when this movie came out, and when I got to see it in the movies, I was like strangely turned on by that Dracula's bride scene with Keanu Reeves. And it had been a long time since I've seen the movie, but still watching it now, I was like, this is a really sexy scene. For as like horrific and scary as it is, I was like, it's pretty fucking sexy.
Well, it's cool, especially with all those little footprints that they did. And then they're raising out of the bed, it's all that, old school movie making, in camera magic that they did. And then of course they're all topless and everything else. But it's like some scenes they're beautiful and some scenes they're fucking disgusting and they're like attached to each other.
And the makeup effects for those brides was amazing too.
Yeah.
I was just like, this neat monsters in this movie.
Yeah. So I've got some fun facts.
God bless you, IMDb. Lay them on me.
Hey, I will have you know that I stayed up for hours reading things and anecdotes and watching the special features and everything else to get these. And only maybe 10% of these come from IMDb.
That's a whole lot of research for this episode. Good God.
I try.
Tell me what they are.
So when Mina, Wynona Ryder, recalls her previous life as Elizabeta, she says she remembers a land beyond a great forest. So land beyond the great forest is the literal meaning of Transylvania. Land. So also, this is Monica Bellucci's first American film. And of course, she'd go on to do movies like Shoot 'Em Up in the last James Bond movie, Spectre. But she also played Persephone in the Matrix sequels. So, of course, in the Matrix, Keanu Reeves is again seduced by a character played by her.
And she's also in Gaspar Noé's first movie. Why the fuck can I think of what it is? But it's a touchstone in the new French extremity movement of horror movies. So she's got some horror cred.
Liam Neeson was considered for and very much wanted the role of Abraham Van Helsing, but after Sir Anthony Hopkins, still writing on the success of Silence of the Lambs, showed interest for the role, Neeson was ultimately turned down.
Thank God.
I don't agree. I feel like Liam Neeson today would do an amazing job as Van Helsing. Back then in 1992, not so much.
No.
Mm-mm. He didn't quite have the weight and gravel in his voice that he does today.
I mean, I just don't think that half the fun in that role is how funny he is, and I just don't think that he could pull it off like that.
So amongst those who auditioned for the part of Dracula were Andy Garcia, who had concerns over the number of sex scenes, Gabriel Byrne, Armand Assante, Antonio Banderas. Could have been interesting.
Okay.
And Viggo Mortensen. And I have to say, I was like, wouldn't Viggo Mortensen been too young? But no, I look back at The Prophecy where he actually played Lucifer. He would have been amazing.
Well, and Antonio Banderas and Armand Assante were in a movie from 1992 called The Mambo Kings, right? So they had a whole lot of success that year already. So I can see where they were in the running. But I mean, out of that particular list, I would like to see... I like Andy Garcia, so I totally watch that, but I don't think he would have done near as good as Gary Oldman.
I don't know. Andy Garcia annoys the shit out of me. So does Gabriel Byrne.
Andy Garcia is just pretty, so really? I'll watch him do things. It's okay. Yeah.
Armand Assante, the only thing I know him from was that weird miniseries for like the Odyssey, like the Iliad that came out.
Oh, where he played Odysseus in that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Antonio Banderas, of course, we got him as Armand, which he did an amazing job at, but I just couldn't see him. I don't know that he could do any other accent besides Spanish, his own Spanish accent.
So a Spanish actor doing a Transylvanian accent. I mean, I'd like to hear it, but I think that it'd be like right on the level of Keanu Reeves' performance in the movie, and it would have just brought the whole thing down.
I would cross oceans of time to find you.
Oh my God. So
Johnny Knoxville was the stunt guy for Keanu Reeves, which I did not know.
What? Is that where he got started for all the...
Yeah, he was a stunt guy. What the fuck show was he on
TV? Jackass, yes. Christ. He was a stuntman before he did all that? I guess that explains a whole lot.
Yeah, he was a stuntman. Okay. A bunch of stuntmen were in Jackass and did all that stuff. But yeah, Johnny Knoxville was the stunt guy for Keanu Reeves. I didn't know that.
How many stunts did he have?
Probably falling off the castle and any number of weird shit that he had to do. Like be thrown off of that wagon when Dracula threw him after getting slit in the throat. That, you never know. Aiko Ishioka, rest her soul, went on to do costumes for more films, notably for working with Tarsem Singh on films like The Cell and The Fall and Immortals, all of which have magnificent costumes worn by actors in large, sometimes gigantic spaces. So, if you've seen Tarsem Singh's films like The Cell or The Fall, the costumes instantly just clicked. I was like, holy shit, yeah, that is her work, man. Like just kind of semi-fantastical, really colorful, beautiful works of art that are the costumes.
We have got to add The Cell to our list of movies to cover.
Francis Ford Coppola traveled to Bucharest to find the fabled resting place of Vlad the Impaler, where he was told that the body was buried without ever finding the head by the locals. It's interesting. So Francis Ford Coppola was also deeply in debt and on the verge of bankruptcy and losing their home as he directed this picture. All of his friends said it was a mistake to do something as far out as Dracula and kind of turn their noses up at him. For the premiere, he and his family went completely off grid so they could I think they went to Guam or something, so he could just get through the weekend without stressing out too much if his entire career was over. But obviously the film was a success. So And if you recall, of course, I mentioned that Francis Ford Coppola went to the tomb of Vlad the Impaler, and that was because he wanted to get on his knees and thank him for his legacy because the movie was so successful and saved his home and everything else.
Is that because like Godfather 3 just didn't do very well at the box office? And I mean, like, I know like Zootrope was his production company and things like that.
No, I believe Godfather 3 actually did fairly well, right? I think it was, what really did it, I think, was a movie called One from the Heart, where it was just such a bad thing. Like Zoetrope Studios finally had to like file Chapter 11, like in 1990 or whatever. And when it changed its name to American Zoetrope, but this movie basically is the movie that saved all of that from happening. So,
Good.
So also Francis Ford Coppola explains in the commentary that Mina and Harker's wedding was a reshoot done at a Los Angeles Greek Orthodox church. So they filmed the entire ceremony with a genuine Orthodox minister and realized afterwards that Wynona Ryder and Keanu Reeves really were married. Yeah,
What?
And that was actually in the news because Keanu Reeves and Wynona Ryder kind of reconvened for a new movie that came out a year or two ago. And which has got like kind of middling reviews or whatever, but they were talking, in kind of some of the YouTube interviews or whatever, that they had looked back and they found out that they were accidentally married. But like if it wasn't legal because no one ever like filed it that way, like with taxes or anything else. So it's like they could just say that they were, but like pretend they weren't.
Oh, so they were like married in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the government, essentially. That's so fucking hilarious. You accidentally get married to somebody.
So yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So they basically filmed the whole thing nonstop. And it was the priest or whatever, an actual priest, and they were actually doing the thing. So
I forgot about that movie that they were in recently because it has something to do with the wedding too. And like after the wedding or something like that. I need to go back and watch that because I want to see what their chemistry is like all these years later. I'm super interested now.
So Francis Ford Coppola, and this is the last one, claims that Bram Stoker's name was included in the title because he has a tradition of putting the author's name in titles of his movies that are adapted from novels like Mario Puzo's The Godfather or John Grisham's The Rainmaker. So others have said or assumed that this is a statement of how close to the novel it is, but it turns out this is not necessarily the case. He literally just puts the novel, the author's name ahead of it to give them credit. And that's just something that he wants to do, which I didn't really know. I thought that was interesting.
Well, and, I kind of like that. I mean, credit needs to be given. And he does a lot of work based on novels, I mean, Apocalypse Now is sort of based on Heart of Darkness, right? Which is really a much older novel, but he really couldn't have done it for that particular point. I just now remembered that he did The Rainmaker. I completely forgot that.
He's done a shit ton. Like I was surprised at movies that I didn't think was Francis Ford Coppola was him, or at least he was involved in, like, Patton, obviously The Godfather. The Conversation is a hugely great movie. I studied today in, film schools. Apocalypse Now, obviously we know, but The Outsiders, didn't realize he did that.
Yes, also a good movie.
Captain EO. From Disneyland and Michael Jackson.
The Michael Jackson ride?
Yeah. And The Rainmaker, and that's basically was kind of his downfall. Like he had this huge golden age in the 70s, and some might say the early 80s, but since then he hasn't really, made a huge hit since then, except for maybe Godfather Part 3 and Bram Stoker's in the 90s in The Rainmaker. But after that, he's just the late 90s and 2000s, 2010s, like nothing has really kicked off.
And he doesn't really need to. I think that his legacy is in film is cemented already. He doesn't have to make any more movies. And, maybe he shouldn't. I think I was just reading an article where Quentin Tarantino was saying that he really is sticking to his final movie thing. He's going into retirement because he says that directing movies is a younger man's game and you want to get out when you're ahead, and so I will have to say for Bram Stoker's Dracula and 1992 in general, I think was a really good year for movies. And I don't know if it's because I was reached a formative age where I was watching movies and, really considering them as pieces of art and not just, fun things to do. But movies like Unforgiven and Howard's End and A River Runs Through It all came out in 1992, and they were all incredibly formative for me as far as like movie watching goes. Howard's End for sure is is one of my favorite movies ever made. And when I was going through the list of awards for Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it just reminded me that all these things came out in that one particular year. And I'm like, God, what a fantastic year for movies that was. And I'm really starting to think that 2019 is, a similar kind of year. And these happen maybe, once or twice a decade. But I mean, what do you think? 1992, like solid year for movies? So. I mean, how old were you in 92?
10.
Yeah.
I mean, this was iconic. This was very formative for my life, as well as The Bodyguard. So
yeah, I mean, if I wasn't gay before Whitney Houston sang those opening lines to "I Will Always Love You," I mean, it certainly was gay after I heard that. So, but yeah, I just I don't know. It just struck me that this was such a good year, and I want to go back and revisit some movies from that year and like compare and contrast. Mm-hmm. So. I may be watching this one again real soon. But like every movie that we cover here on the Film Flamers, we have a series of questions, and we'll start out with, is Bram Stoker's Dracula a horror movie?
I think so. Obviously, I mean, it's obviously a horror movie, but a lot of people might have, something to say about that, because if they, didn't get scared or this or that, to me, there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of scary moments. Especially, I was freaked out by several things, like the giant bat, especially freaked the hell out of me as a kid, but this is a gothic romance. And I have to say, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure that there are no jump out effects. There are no jump scares in this entire movie.
Yeah. I jump scares work for me even now as a 40-year-old man, and I didn't jump.
If they're original and if they're good and if they're deserved.
Yeah.
But this movie didn't even attempt it. It was just going straight for tone, which I love.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree. I think it's a horror movie. I know that a lot of people would disagree. They would call it romance. They would call it gothic or whatever, horror adjacent, But when you're dealing with a vampire, when you're dealing with Dracula, which could quite possibly be one of the most, if not the most recognized horror character, then you have to squarely cement this movie in horror canon.
Yeah. I mean, we've got huge amount of gore and creature and monster effects, a lot of macabre. And then we go below the scene. There's loss of innocence and loss of religion, and betrayal at like an epic, theological level, and, and sexuality and questions of, what's sin and what's innocence and blah, 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 blah. But there's just a lot of things in this movie that are tied to horror, and the fall of man, really, as some sort of, divine existence, And
if you want to talk about like real life horrors, I think that this movie has something to say about like the sexual repression of women back in like Victorian England and things like that. I mean, there's so many reasons that you can call this a horror movie,
And yeah, we could do a whole another episode just mining the novels, stuff on the sexuality of that time, and thoughts on morality and, women and religion and everything else, and how vampirism is a venereal disease, and maybe even the homoeroticism of Dracula. And, there's a whole bunch of stuff to mine there that's just based on the actual novel and the story, not necessarily owned by this movie, though. Right. But right. I don't know. Maybe we can do some sort of extra thing about all those things, but I don't know.
Yeah, it could be a separate Patreon conversation, maybe. I think we've already talked about this a little and maybe answered it a little, but were you scared watching Bram Stoker's Dracula?
As a kid, certainly. And I was, and I continue to be creeped out by it in certain scenes. Certainly, every time I watch it, it's something new to look at every single time. This is an infinitely rewatchable film, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I have to change. I should not have let it gone, 2 decades without watching this movie, but it really made for a very enjoyable watch this particular go round. I'm always a little scared when she's walking down the crypt stairs with that baby. I think it's a really intense scene. I think it's visually striking, and that always scares me. Some of the creature effects scared me a lot when I was a kid. I think I was particularly scared of that 2-bodied woman at the Dracula's Bride scene when I was younger. Like, that really haunted my dreams for a long time. So, yeah, there's lots of scary imagery, and I think that, people can be scared watching this movie.
You should see the original painting that's based off of.
I'm going to look it up right after we're through recording, actually. Our new question that we've added for 2020 is, out of 5 stars, what would you rate Bram Stoker's Dracula?
This was not a perfect movie, but it comes damn close in my mind, so I'm giving it a 4.5.
That is exactly what I rated it on Letterboxd the other day. And I was expecting to rate it a whole lot lower. It's just that by the time that the movie was over, I had such a good fucking time watching it and just enjoyed the shit out of it so much. As soon as it was done, like normally I'll start another movie or just like reflect in a certain way, but I put my headphones in and I went straight to the score to listen to it. And I rarely ever do that after watching a movie. And I mean, I loved it so much. And so 4.5 stars out of 5 is what I had to give it. Like you said, it's not perfect, but it is really, really close.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's like a perfect storm for me. I mean, from a technical perspective, how they did it, I'm just all over that as like a film nerd and a technical geek, you know, like I'm just eating that up, right? And as far as like the costumes and the artistry and the aesthetic and the tone, like it's all coming together. It was a huge love letter to film and to gothic romance and to horror all in one. And I'd say like the little imperfections are like tonal shifts or like, you know, some of the acting and things like that. You know, I might, you know, depending on my watch or the time of my life, put it down to a 4, you know, or something. But, you know, right now, I have to say, especially after doing all this research, you know, 4.5, easy.
And I will add that I think that if this movie were made in a time where they had expanded the number of Best Picture nominees, I think that this would have gotten a Best Picture nomination. You know, I mean, four nominations for all these craft awards is nothing to scoff at. But, you know, sometimes we see these movies that are solely like awarded in love for their craft work and not just for like acting or, you know, writing. This would have been a Best Picture nominee had we had 10 nominees in 1992. I'm particularly sure of that.
Especially since it made, you know, it got, you know, nominated for 4 and won 3 Oscars. And that's a lot for any kind of horror movie.
I think it's a well-received movie in Hollywood. And I don't hear people talking about it very often. And that's kind of a shame. In fact, my nephew, like I'm sort of been guiding him on these like horror movies, right? As he's becoming interested in them. And I think the next time he's over, we're going to sit down and watch Bram Stoker's Dracula because I think that he would like it.
Totally.
So finally, and some might say most importantly, who's the hottest guy in Bram Stoker's Dracula?
So to me, the hottest guy is hands down Billy fucking Campbell.
Yes, ma'am.
With his really big Bowie knife.
We don't always agree on this particular question because normally I think that most people would say like, you know, Keanu Reeves, some sort of like Stone Cold Fox.
I've
90s
never
Keanu's
thought he
pretty,
was
but
particularly attractive.
He's attractive, but Billy Campbell, my God.
And normally I'm not into mustaches, but he fucking wrecks it.
Yeah, he's so hot in this movie. I don't know. I was kind of like, I was waiting to ask this question, you know, because I was watching it and I was like, I wonder who he's going to pick, you know, because this is where I go now when I watch a horror movie. I'm like, who's Chris is going to think is the hottest guy? And I was like, if he fucking says Cary Elwes, I swear to God, I'm going to come across this microphone and beat it to death with it.
No, Cary Elwes is just like adorable, right? He was such smartly cast because anyone else you would just like, that's an asshole, you know, but he has such like a little sparkle in his eye that he, you know, you're okay. You know, we're in good hands with Cary, but Billy Campbell smoking hot.
That's right. And I mean, I'm just biased because I'm sitting here in Texas right now and he's playing some Texan, but I mean, Billy Campbell outside of that mustache, even today, is a pretty man, and
this is probably a good movie for the straights too. There's so many like tits popping out of nightgowns that
oh, it's just something for everyone. Yeah, I wonder how many straight guys are like, oh my God, her titty just popped out of that orange nightgown, and we're like, I would love to put that on.
Well, they kept doing that too. Like she's like sitting there in bed and her tits popping out, and the guy's like, little girl, and I'm like, don't call her that. Stop it.
That's a little off-putting.
She's so young.
Oh, my sweet little girl.
He doesn't do that then.
Nasty
I think it's Van Helsing that's like, oh, she's just a child, you know, with her boobs out. Just like, don't say that. Right after he fucking like, sniffs Wynona Ryder like right in the face. Creepy old fuck.
What a masterful performance he gave, I swear.
But yeah, Billy Campbell. Why couldn't we have more of him?
Let's, shall we? We'll find his address. We'll just have
No,
more
like
of
he
him
went
right
on
now.
and he did like Rocketeer, I guess, actually before Bram Stoker's in 1991. But after that, he's basically relegated to television movies and stuff.
Yeah, and supporting roles. I mean, he never really caught on after The Rocketeer, but I mean, he's got classic good looks. I thought in The Rocketeer he was very, very classically handsome. And
Maybe he should have kept the mustache.
hey, I'll take him either way. Well, I have really enjoyed talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula and really enjoyed watching it quite a bit. So thank you for adding this to the list. We have a lot of stuff coming up for you in February. After this, we're continuing our romantic theme of February by talking about our top 10 favorite horror romances.
Yes, indeed. And there's so much gold to mine there.
Yes, a lot, actually, and I was kind of surprised. And we have a hot take coming out at the end of the month, too, so make sure you stick around for that. As always, we are creating lots of bonus content over on Patreon, and we have a very special flashback episode coming. So head over to patreon.com/thefilmflamers. You can get all of our bonus content and early access to our episodes for as low as $2.
And if you don't know what that episode is by now, you're probably just not paying attention.
Yeah. If you don't know what that episode is by now, I'll have to run to you. Or I have nothing, whichever song fits. I don't know. Guys, we'd like to know what you think about Bram Stoker's Dracula and our episode, all of our thoughts on it. You can find us on social media at The Film Flamers on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and now Letterboxd, where we will be combining our ratings of movies that we've watched and putting them on there. So go check us out.
And you can email us at tiredqueens@filmflamers.com, or you can call us at our hotline at 972-666-7733 and let your voice be heard, and we will respond to it in kind.
That's right. We'll be playing that voicemail or Shooting the Flames episode along with any reviews that we get over on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. We've gotten a couple that we're going to be reading in our next Shooting the Flames episode, so we're super excited about that. Keep them coming, guys. It's time for us to run off into the night following those children and the sweet music they make. So until our next episode, sweet dreams. What sweet music they make. Every time I say it, I sound like
what sweet music
like
they make.
feeble. I don't know. Fuck me.
I have crossed oceans of time to find you.
Take me away from all this. Yes. Calm down, Wynona. Wynona, your pills.
I just want Wynona to come up right after they're doing that whole thing. Take me away from all this death. And they're making out and everything. And all the boys just come crashing in to fight Dracula. I just want her to be like, "You ruined it! You ruined everything!"
No, she has to go full on West Side Story and be like, "Don't you touch him!"
No, she should have said that at the end. Before going to the church. We need to remake
Get
this movie.
away from him! Don't you touch him! Oh, she went full on Maria. Okay, shit. All right, I'm gonna stop recording now.